Hello everyone, I'm Shelley Hughes and I am running for governor. It's 2026 and we're starting out a new series here where I'm going to be bringing in experts on various issues. Please give us your feedback, your input. I'm excited because our first guest is David Bays, and he is an expert on the bycatch issue, which we're all learning more and more about as a real issue in the state that's having impact beyond what you might realize. So I'm going to just, first of all, thanks David for coming. And I was thinking of the story of David and Goliath, actually, in regard to you, because taking on an issue like this, where there's a lot of money and some big corporations that are involved in the trawling industry, and how large the problem has actually become in our state. It's kind of a Goliath right now, and but you've got a lot of people now understanding and cheering for you along the mountainside there as you go out to slay the giant. So anyway, just first of all, tell us a little bit about your background and why this is a hot issue for you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking it on too. We've said a lot of times that the state of Alaska governor is the most important person in this process. So in the past, we've had a hard time getting somebody to take it on because it is big and complex, but it's something that the voters have demanded. So to see candidates respond to that is really encouraging. So I grew up in Homer, Alaska. I had a charter fishing company there, and the spot that we'd really get into it was halibut allocation each year. So 20 years ago, there were more halibut in the ocean, and each year they would set the halibut limits for the sport fishermen on charter boats. But before they do that, they take the trawl bycatch of halibut off the top. And when there were more halibut, everybody grumbled about that a little bit and said it was waste and it was wrong, but it didn't really impact our limits. But fast forward 10 years, it started to. So they started to cut back how much the charter anglers could take. But the trawl bycatch limit wasn't going down, and so now we see that there's about 3 times as much halibut bycatch done by trawl as is done by sport fishermen. Wow. And so then the hypocrisy gets to where people can't take it anymore, and we've got conversations about like the salmon crisis on the Yukon River. There's habitat issues, and so it's really just come to a head as the fish levels have dropped. So.
And when did you really become the major spokesperson for this? When did you really get involved? I know for me it's been an issue. I heard about it maybe a little over a year or two ago, and it may have been that page, I can't remember, but it really became a big deal to me this spring when Senator Crunk filed SB 161 to ban trawling in state waters, and began to learn about the issue and the impacts. And also I chaired a task force with 36 members on the topic of agriculture and food security, and fish did come up. So as it's being such an important protein and nutrient and sustenance for so many Alaskans, especially in rural Alaska and part of our culture. So it's rather a new issue to me. And by the way, there's been some conversations because, you know, I made the video laying out kind of a real specific plan as addressing certain things at the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council level, what we could do in state waters and state regs, and then the pressure points with the federal government. And so in the course of that, people said, well, you know, you were serving, why didn't you take care of this? Well, first of all, and I will ask you if you agree, but as one of 60, you can't do something like that, and it is rather a new issue. I know it was a long, it's been more than a year, correct? But wouldn't you say in maybe the last 2 years, and probably since the Ocean with David Attenborough documentary came out, it is really exploded as far as Alaskans understanding. Would you say it's really been concentrated more in the last year or two? And then if you could repeat a little bit the role that the legislature versus the governor versus anyone else as far as impact, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so the intensity in the conversation has definitely been building. Mary Peltola we'd talked about when Dawn Young had died. She had previous to that been working on Yukon River bycatch issues, and she brought it to a national stage, and that was the first time a lot of people saw it or heard of it. But really the intensity has built up in the last couple of years, and we've actually been stating in the group that, hey, 2026 is the year that we want governor candidates to take this on in a meaningful way. We felt like we hadn't had successes getting Dunleavy to take it on, and so we'd kind of put it off and said, all right, it's terrible, nobody likes it, but 2026 is going to be the year that people have to talk about it to get elected. So I think that's leaked in, and like I say, it's very encouraging that we're getting feedback from candidates who are listening to on-the-ground voters. So the state of Alaska legislature can deal with it in smaller ways. I guess we should get into what the NPFMC is and how it's broken down. But so trawling, the majority of it happens more than 3 miles offshore of Alaska, and that's in the federally regulated waters. And so the feds regulate fishing in those waters through the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, the NPFMC. And so you'll hear a lot of conversation, and this has been the governor conversation, the legislature conversation forever, was that, hey, we're sorry that this is happening 3 miles offshore, but we physically can't do anything about it, legally can't do anything about it because it's a federal council. But the big crossover point with that is that the Alaska governor gets to choose 6 of the 11 members on this federal NPFMC. So Magnuson-Stevens Act, which had created this council, gave the state of Alaska governor a guaranteed majority on the NPFMC. And it's a majority rules voting process. So if the 6 people who the Alaska governor chooses decide to vote on a certain way or on a certain trawl issue, that goes. There could be lawsuits that follow it up. The Secretary of Commerce could get in it later. But under the current regulatory system, the state of Alaska governor has this huge power, is arguably the most powerful person in the process. So
the governor's role is pretty pivotal to this. And there has been a little bit of confusion because the legislature does confirm Board of Fish members. Those are state Board of Fish members, and does vote to confirm commissioners, including the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Commissioner. But the legislature does not vote to confirm the governor's appointees to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. That's actually, is the U.S. Secretary of Commerce put the stamp of approval on those? The governors put forward, the Washington governor and the Oregon governor, is that correct?
Correct,
yeah. And then the U.S. Secretary is the one kind of puts the stamp on? Is that how it works?
It is, yep. So the NPFMC term lasts 3 years. When that comes up for renewal, the state of Alaska governor puts forward 3 names for who could possibly fill that seat, and then that info goes up to the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce picks one. Traditionally, the first one is a rubber stamped, and they confirm it. But yeah, the legislature has nothing to do with it except for confirming this ADFG commissioner. And it's also very tough for the legislature to be involved in the federal part of it unless they were, for instance, to drag the ADFG commissioner in and say, hey, why are things on the NPFMC happening this way? But it's quite honestly been confusing. I've gotten feedback from people that have said, hey, if you run for office, don't touch fisheries because it's too complex. But that used to work when there was more fish for everybody in the ocean, but now we're getting to this critical tipping point where the state just can't afford to be sloppy anymore.
It is, that's one of the things that the more I learned about that, particularly learning what happened out off the Atlantic coast, of how the habitat was destroyed and really shut down all kinds of fishing. And we're getting close to that point here. And there are multiple factors, of course. There's a lot of research, a lot of funding has gone into all of these different things. Is the temperature of the water changing slightly? What are the foreign vessels doing? Foreign hatcheries? I mean, there's all kinds of issues, and we acknowledge that. But I think this one that's human caused, it's something that, we could actually do something about this. And I think as we realize how much it's impacted the kitchen tables of Alaskans, and also the other types of commercial fisheries in this state, because all commercial fisheries aren't the same, and you know, I have a nephew who actually has been commercial fishing the last few years, and he was actually drawing the different types and what this call is this call, but he was very, very concerned about trawling. He commercial fishes a little bit in Southeast and also in Bristol Bay. But I think for those, a lot of Alaskans are new to this, but they realize it's important because we are, like you said, at the tipping point. And so could we talk a little bit before we get any further, some of the numbers and the data and what's actually happening to, you know, maybe about the size of the gear and the amount of the ocean floor that's being disturbed, those kind of things, because, and you know, and I hope that our people listening to this, their eyes won't glaze over, because the data is really fascinating and it's the foundation for why it's such a problem. So could you explain some of that?
It is, yeah. And so the interesting thing with trawl is from the second we brought this issue up, we immediately got this pushback of kind of like the old guard fishermen that said, hey, these trawlers, maybe they're the dirtiest ones in the room, maybe they're tearing up the habitat in a way that nobody else does, but we're not going to talk badly about them because they're fishermen too, you know, these are your brothers essentially. And there is truth to that, but it's also extremely dangerous, you know. So we look at like the East Coast and the crash of the Grand Banks cod, and those people there'd been awareness about dragging there, and there'd been concerns from the other fishermen, but nobody'd really taken it on, and it finally went so far that it crashed. And when it crashed, it didn't just take out the cod that the trawlers were fishing for, it was this whole ecosystem drop. And so when that happened, in a lot of instances, the trawl boats were big enough to lift up what they were doing, go somewhere else in the U.S. and keep trawling, but the local residents couldn't do that. The small fishermen and the people that fish for other things are essentially stuck there cleaning up the mess. And so that's been a big concern with Alaska, is that the trawl, especially the factory trawl model, is mobile. It could fish anywhere in the world. Right now, most of the crews fly up from Seattle, they land in Dutch Harbor, step on the boat, and they fish, and they could do that anywhere. So obviously they'd like for their fishery to keep going, but it's not like their kids and their kids and their kids are going to depend on what happens right here. They have other options where most of us don't. But the reason that trawl gets so much flack is that it typically targets high volume, low value fish. So the pollock and flounder are two big examples, and those range from like 3 cents a pound to 9 cents a pound. And so the only way to make money off of them is to catch essentially billions of pounds. Yeah, literal billions of pounds.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to catch billions of pounds of fish, you can't do it with a hook and line, and you can't do it with a gill net, or you can't do it with a small boat. It has to be this massive factory model, essentially, or big. They're not all factory boats, but
can I interrupt you, because I hear factory trawler. What's the difference between just a trawler and a factory trawler?
Yeah, so they're called, the technical term in the NOAA documents is a catcher vessel or a catcher processor. So a catcher vessel, pretty self-explanatory. It goes out to sea, it catches fish, and then it brings it back to a separate location for processing. So they have to bring their fish back to shore, or sometimes they'll actually transfer their net to another boat on the fishing grounds. They call a mothership that sucks it in and processes the fish on the grounds. But then the factory trawlers, or the catcher processor is the other name, is they do it all in one. So they bring the fish up, they dump it down below deck, and then there's an entire factory line of fish processing happening on this boat. And a lot of those boats are ships, essentially, so they'll be huge. You know, from 150 to about 350 feet would be the big ones, so bigger than a football field. But those get a lot of critiques because the factory trawl model really doesn't need the infrastructure of Alaska to exist. Most of them they're all home ported in Seattle, and so they stock up there. They'll fly mechanics back and forth. They'll fly specialists back and forth, and a lot of them, their business model is that their product never touches ground in Alaska or even the USA. So the most efficient way for them to get their fish to the market is they go out on the grounds, catch the pollock, freeze it in these 50-pound blocks, and then they offload it to what they call trampers, which will meet them in like a cove in the Aleutian Islands. They unload this fish, and then that goes straight to China or Asia or Europe or whatever. And so those get a lot of critiques, because then you have fish that never touches the ground
No financial
in the U.S.
No financial benefit.
A little
to
bit.
Alaska? Are they
They,
paying a landing fee or something when they're in the Aleutian?
Correct, yeah. So there is a commercial fisheries landing tax that is, I believe, 3.5% of what they're being paid per pound. But there again, on a fish that's worth 3 to 10 cents per pound, it's not much, essentially. But the other part of when you get into why trawl is preferred for these low-value fish is the size of the net and the way it fishes. So the biggest factory trawlers, they say you could stack 3 747 jets plus the Eiffel Tower inside of the net.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah, that's big. And they the foot rope on the net, the guiding forward edge, on the biggest ones is about 1/4 mile wide. So then you get into like impact on the environment. If you're cutting this 1/4 mile swath with every drag of the net, you start to add up into these incredible square miles impacts. So they say the biggest boats will drag about 6 square miles of seafloor per boat per day. So if you're talking about 6 miles per day, 35 boats fishing 250 days per year, you're up 40,000 square miles of seafloor per year, and a lot of the boats fish over the same area, so it's not like it's a new 35,000 miles every year, but you also don't have the chance for that seafloor to recover at any point. And fishermen, all fishermen, don't just go out and randomly cover all parts of the ocean equally. They have to focus on where the fish are, which is where the current upwellings are, so the underwater seamounts or the ledges or the edges. And so trawl will make this claim of, hey, we don't actually cover this much seafloor, and we don't do new seafloor, but they do fish where all the productivity of the ocean is. So it's like this oasis in the desert, this underwater seamount or ledge. And so they have massive impacts on the fish they're catching and the fish that other people are looking for. And then trawl, by nature, it's essentially indiscriminate. So the captain of the trawl boat has to catch a lot of fish in a little bit of time. They benefit by if they only catch their target species, say pollock or flounder, but at the same time, because the gear is so big, they can't control what goes into the net. So there'd been big...
I like the analogy of the bowl of chicken noodle soup. You're taking a slotted spoon to get the chicken, but you're getting all the noodles too. And so it's very much like that. And can you talk a little bit about actually the numbers as far as how it's impacting? And then the thing that's fascinating to me, that's only what you can see, right, and the count. But beneath the water, those dark waters, what else is being disturbed or destroyed? We talked about the floor itself, but there could be a lot of marine life also that is also, that's not even being counted.
Correct.
And I understand that if there were estimates made, that there would probably be lawsuits about those estimates, but it seems with the science and technology that we have, we could study sections, of that lower part in the dark waters and actually get good estimates. I'd be so curious what that is, because and the disturbance, we were talking before we turned the cameras on about the fact that this is probably going to actually impact mammals in Alaska, and we're already seeing that bears aren't getting the salmon that they normally would have access to, and so they are beginning to turn towards caribou and moose. So this kind of thing, the circle of life, the chain of life, whatever you want to call it, it's actually a huge thing. So stemming the problem is really important, and I people can be critical of me for not stepping into this now. I wish I would have known more about it a couple of years ago, but I really wouldn't have been in the role that I could help this matter. But having myself lived in rural parts of the state, I lived in Hoonah, I lived in Bethel, I lived in Fort Yukon. I remember in Hoonah, the protein from fish was huge, and spending a lot of time as a teenager young woman processing fish, because it was a major part of our diet, as a family. So this is real, and so I do think we're at a critical juncture, because once you've got bears that are going to start impacting your moose and caribou, that's a problem. In fact, you said Governor Dunleavy extended, was it the moose season? Because he knew some of those people upriver weren't going to have the amount of salmon, that protein, so he was trying to help on the moose end. But now if the bears are going after the moose, I mean, what are we doing here? So let's get back to the root of the problem. What is happening in the ocean, and understanding, of course, that there are other factors. This is not the sole factor, but this is one that we can have impact and make some changes. And I'll just throw it here too. I find it fascinating because they talk in Juneau sometimes about fish wars. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase. Fish wars. Oh, stay out of fish wars, you know. And you'd have a few people that really, you know, really knew their stuff, maybe on the commercial side, really knew their stuff on the sports side, and there'd be this kind of thing. But this is actually really unifying because it's impacting all user groups. And I know as far as personal use and sport and subsistence and all the other non-trawler commercial fishing, everyone is concerned about it. And now it's kind of interesting because some people that aren't really into even any of that, just because they're Alaskans, and hey, you know, this is an important part of who we are, and so a lot of people are really concerned. So I just want to throw out that this is bigger than just a handful of people. It's starting, the ramifications are really exponentially reaching outward. I mean, that's the way I see it, because I think I probably heard something about it maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe with Mary Patola when she was running. But now this is becoming something we can't ignore. And as far as timing and when we could actually destroy and crash our fisheries, like happened in the Atlantic, do you have any clue how much time we have to try to get a handle on this?
No, but there are some signs out there. So the indicator, or the reason that the Yukon River subsistence issue gets so high into it is that subsistence fishing for chum salmon and Chinook on the Yukon has been closed since 2020, so it's now 5 years in. And Chinook is preemptively being closed for the next 7 years.
There also?
Correct, yeah, on the entire Yukon. So that was an agreement between Canada and the USA. So that's going to be closed down for 12 years. 2032
then, from basically 2020 to 2032?
Correct, okay. Yeah. But when you look at these, so NOAA is the agency which regulates these federal fisheries. When you look at their data, they say that the chum salmon are going out to sea and starving to death, essentially, and they've blamed that on a lot of things. Global warming is the biggest one. There's no denying that there's been variation in the temperature. But you also look at NOAA's documents and they say, well, yeah, pollock is a primary food for these chum, and pollock is a primary food for seabirds and sea lions and gray whales, and all of those species have been mysteriously starving to death kind of at the same time. And so that really...
And they all feed on pollock?
Pollock at some point.
Okay.
Correct. And the, yeah, you know, we've been rubber stamping through the NPFMC a pollock harvest in the state of about 3 billion pounds per year. So I think if you run the math down on that per hour, it's like 300,000 pounds of pollock per hour averaged out over the year. So massive, I mean, unfathomable extractions. And that could be fine if nothing else was being impacted, but what we're seeing is that all these things which feed on pollock are now giving us this signal of we're starving to death.
Everything's connected.
It is. And there's also another really interesting thing on pollock and this conversation about whether or not it should be called a forage fish. So, or it's going to be a complicated analogy, but so there are kind of two levels of the ocean. So sunlight comes into the ocean, plankton does photosynthesis, it converts this sunlight into energy, and then something eats the plankton and essentially transfers it from this plant into this meat source that everything else can eat. Seabirds and whales can't eat plankton, they need an intermediary. And so that's where a forage fish comes in. And in the Bering Sea especially, pollock is written up in all these documents as that intermediary. So it would be like if you had a pack of wolves living in this lush grassland it doesn't matter how green the grass is and how great the soil is, unless there's something like a deer or a rabbit there to convert that plant energy into meat, all these upstream predators starve to death. And so that's this big conversation in how pollock, especially in the Bering Sea, should be regulated. It'd be analogous to herring. You know, when we think of herring, we think of, oh my God, those are bait fish. We have to protect the herring for everything else. And pollock in the Bering Sea especially does that exact same thing. Okay. And so that's where it's gotten. You talked about earlier these Alaskans who don't fish at all, who just inherently understand that there are issues with this trawl stuff. And that's really where the governor's choices for the NPFMC come into that, is that there are these issues like, pollock should have been regulated as a forage fish for 40 years, but that would cut down on how much trawl could catch, so it just mysteriously hasn't happened. There's a big issue with midwater nets being allowed to drag on bottom in areas that are closed to bottom trawling, and that mysteriously hasn't been regulated. Trawls happen in halibut nurseries still, and that's been an issue for 40 years and well documented, but there again, the NPFMC just hasn't done anything. And
so there are certain regs that are out there that they've chosen to suspend, or they're not enforcing.
Correct, yeah, and a lot of it comes down to
suspend or not enforce. I mean, the regs are still sitting there and they're not enforcing them.
Yeah, so really what it comes down to is interpret. So like the issue of midwater nets being on bottom, they've now said it's not actually illegal for the midwater net to touch bottom. It would only be illegal if that net caught 20 crab during the 6 hours that it was towed. So they have sonar, they have all this data. The captains have reported that the midwater nets are on the seafloor 40 to 100% of the time. But as far as legal enforcement of that law, they keep saying, well, this net only brought up 19 crabs, so it must not have been on bottom. But the nets are designed in a way that bycatch falls out of them, and they kind of have these ways to game the system, and it's pretty transparent, and the complaints about it have been logged extensively. But it still just comes down to these people on the NPFMC, and you would think the Alaska representatives would vote in favor of changing this or tightening it up, or saying, hey, this was obviously the intent of this regulation, and it needs to be enforced that way. But if we don't have people on the NPFMC voting that way, it still just kind of skips along in the middle, which makes Alaskans in general mad, whether they fish or not. And you really get into this issue of, should the federal government be making this decision about how Alaskan resources are managed in the first place, which is where we rely on a governor to step in and say, hey, this is what Alaska wants, and that comes first. If Alaskans have enough fish and game, then other people can have them, but we have to take care of the voters first. So.
Yeah, and this is all rooted in the Magnuson-Stevens Act, right? Was that 1976? And
correct.
Our former and beloved U.S. Senator Ted Stevens was part of that, and wasn't part of it to address the fact that we had foreign vessels coming very close to Alaska. So they actually, is it correct, they extended the federal waters out to 200 feet.
200 miles, yeah.
I'm 200 feet. 200 miles, absolutely. 200 miles. So now we've got this zone that the federal government is controlling, and that's why the NPFMC was put into place. And I understand there are a total of 8, because we had all the coastlines on the Atlantic and the Pacific, a total of 8 of these councils, and that's how it all started, correct? And so we've kind of fixed the foreign vessels, so it's only American vessels that are coming into that zone now, right? And, you know, it's interesting, and you started off by saying, you know, the governor really is the one, kind of the linchpin that can help fix this. And I've had conversations with some from our federal delegation here recently, and one of the real challenges, and I know people might get upset because, you know, Congressman Bycatch, he would like to see this fixed as well. And one of the problems is the way the process works in D.C. So Senator Maria Cantwell in Washington is not going to support how would we need to fix this, because she's got her Washington vessels, her trawlers, her corporations, And so there's no way to get something that way through the U.S. Senate at this particular point in time. So really trying to get the NPFMC, you say it really fast because you're used to saying NPFMC, to get them to do the right thing. That is actually probably our best remedy, even though there are things we can do in state waters to show, set the precedent and be the example. And back in May, I was supportive of doing that, and I'm hoping Senator Cronk's bill will get some traction, or at least some more hearings, so people learn more about it. But that is definitely an example. And of course, at some point, if at the federal level, so you could do it in state waters, and anything in state regs, and there are a number of things we can do. We could talk about that. You can do it at the NPFMC, which is the best at this point. It's the most achievable that's going to solve the problem, because if you do the state water thing, your bycatch is still going to be high, because it's not so much. There's not a whole lot of trawling in state waters,
Correct,
right?
yeah.
So it doesn't really solve it. And then at the federal level, it looks like the blockades are pretty difficult. Probably aren't going to make any big changes at that point, even though I think we should still really press and make it a bigger deal, because this isn't, it's very much, I think, in my mind, because we know people actually have less protein and sustenance. In fact, we were running numbers while we were waiting for our camera equipment, that it would not be unreasonable for the amount of protein that a family is fishing for in some of these villages, depending on the size of the family. It's a $5,000, $10,000 impact when they don't have the protein. And so it is very much that, but I'm looking back even bigger picture. If we cause a fisheries crash overall, the economic impact and the livelihoods of families in so many ways, it's just going to be bad. In fact, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you know just the commercial fishing industry in Alaska outside of trawling, what that kind of the value, economic value is of that?
I don't know off the top of my head. And one thing that's been really interesting and pointed out is, so they've talked about like the crab crash in 2020. There again, Noah said the water got warmer, the crab starved to death, but trawl has a big impact on crab too. And so previous to that crashing, the crab fishery had been worth about an equal amount to the trawl fishing, along with everything else. But now crab got shut down, and so trawl gets to kind of parade and say, hey, we're the big money makers. But everybody that's been around for more than 5 years says, yeah, you are now, but previous to this, everything else had been. So there's this kind of weird power shift, and as these other fishermen get shut down, as halibut longline quotas get cut back or crabbing gets cut back, it's essentially too late for those fishermen. They lose their fishing income, so they don't have the money to sue, and they don't have the money to lobby back. And so there's just been this accumulation of power of trawl, because it's the one with the big boats and the volume, essentially, to keep fishing through all this. And so it actually ironically gets harder and harder to crack into that process. One of the really interesting things on the NPFMC conversation, and if you take it back to its regulated, or the NPFMC was created by the Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1976. The Stevens in the Magnuson-Stevens Act is Ted Stevens. And you can see where he did us a big favor in there. So of these 11 voting members, he, assumably, was the one that wrote in that Alaska always gets 6 seats on here. So there was an acknowledgement that, yeah, Oregon has some interests in it, Washington has some interest in it, the feds want to have a little bit of interest in it, but nothing can ever break this majority vote by the 6 NPFMC members.
So it's 6 Alaskans. Is it 3 from Washington, 1 from Oregon, and then does the Secretary of Commerce get point one? Or
nah, the National Marine Fisheries NIMPS whoever the Alaska regional director of that is, or essentially the top national marine fisheries person in Alaska, gets the 11th voting seat on the NPFMC.
And that's usually somebody, a resident of Alaska. It's just they have that national role.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That is good to know. I just want to make the point that the commercial fishing industry is really important. We don't know those economic impact, but if the whole thing were to shut down, it would be devastating. So a lot of families rely on it. And so that's at this critical juncture. If we were going to hit the point where it could totally crash here, and we don't know how long that might be, it is time to take action. But as far as I don't personally have any problem with the commercial fishing, even if it's a large vessel or whatever, getting lots of fish and making some good money. They've all got families to feed too. But if it's kind of extra fish that Alaskans don't need, and we're at the point now where we don't have extra fish. In fact,
correct.
You mentioned at the very beginning that the halibut charters, compared to what the trawlers are allowed to take, and how it is total hypocrisy. It's totally unfair, and that is happening also. Like we're experiencing restrictions and shutdowns for Alaskans in our rivers, while there doesn't seem to be much happening on the trawling end. Is that correct?
It is. Yeah, so there was one really clear example last year. I think it was in October, 2 years ago, October of 2024. There was a headline about trawlers in Kodiak, or fishing out of Kodiak Island, had I think 11,000 king salmon as bycatch in a single week. But there's king salmon rivers on Kodiak Island that same year got back like 46 kings, total on this run that used to have been thousands.
But you said 11,000 by the industry? 11,000
Correct,
kings?
yeah. In a week.
And 46?
Coming back to these local rivers. And not all the king salmon or chum salmon that they get as bycatch they can do genetic testing, and they know not all of them are from Alaska, but king salmon have been crashing up and down the west coast. I mean, it's a huge issue. So to see waste happening at that level and that intensity anywhere, whether those fish were all going to come back to our rivers or not, is just simply not sustainable. And that's what really gets at the heart of it for Alaskans. Is everybody here is pro-fish and pro-fishing, and we have commercial fishing neighbors. We like to eat fish, but there's just this issue of whether or not it's actually sustainable, and the writing on the wall says that trawl isn't, and trawl at this level of extraction has never made it for 100 years anywhere in the world. There's all these examples of countries banning trawl fisheries crashing, and then we get to Alaska and we get in the NPFMC and they say, oh, there's no problem here, this is the best sustained fishery in the world, as seabirds starve to death and fall out of the air. So that's what's got Alaskans worried. And there's also this, you hear conversations about wanton waste sometimes. That's a big theme for Alaskan hunters. It's a law, but it's also essentially a lifestyle if you don't waste fish and game. And so we have, again, this hypocrisy of someone might fail to remove 2 pounds of moose rib meat from the field. They could have a ticket, they could lose their gun or their hunting privileges, versus trawl that reports dumping about 16,000 pounds of fish per hour every hour of the year.
16,000 pounds per hour every hour.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, so 141 million pounds per year is their 10-year average. And earlier we talked about this issue of what's happening underwater. So when we get trawl bycatch numbers from NOAA, they tell us that 141 million pounds of bycatch came up on the boat. NOAA determined it was dead, and that was what they call the observed bycatch. But nothing is said about what's called unobserved bycatch. So earlier we talked about how the biggest trawl boats will tow about 6 square miles of seafloor per boat per day. Nobody has any idea how many pounds of, coral or anemones or bait fish get stirred up and then eaten by predator fish. As a result, that's all unobserved bycatch, and NOAA Fisheries doesn't make any attempt at quantifying that and wrapping it up into its
And that's what I was bringing up earlier. I think
correct.
with the technology we have today, that they could quantify it and that they should quantify it, because especially we talked about everything being connected. Some of these things that are being destroyed are impacting different species and different things that then we're all beginning to experience the ramifications inland, and way inland, with our mammals. So it is something that I think is that it's time to address. From the other side, where they kind of push back, let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the things I've heard about is the processors who process fish for the other types of commercial fishing vessels. They wouldn't be able to operate year-round because the fish from the trawlers is kind of their mainstay. So could you talk about that, how this might impact the processors, because they're an important part of our fishing industry, and I don't know how many Alaskans work as part of the processing industry. Are those mostly from Seattle, or do we have a lot of Alaska owned and based processing here?
I think it gets quite a bit of imported labor. I don't know if it's necessarily foreign, but quite a bit from outside of Alaska. But there again, it comes back to what we talked about with prior to 2020, like the total crab fishery had been worth as much or more than the total trawl fisheries. So crab processing plants used to be big and kind of run these shows. And if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, before trawl became big in Alaska, there were strong, Kodiak was the king crab capital of the world at the time, and now they essentially have none, but they have heavy trawl presence, and so there's been these historic trade-offs. And if you took trawl catch out of it tomorrow, there would absolutely be this dip of, hey, what do we do now? But I think everyone's universal hope, and if you turn back the history book a little bit, is that if we took all that pressure off, that these other more artisanal fisheries would fill in and recreate the market and recreate the jobs, and maybe in different ways and maybe at less volume, but the evidence is there to say that that would eventually happen. But the rest of that conversation is that it's kind of like clear cutting. So you could, if say we discovered that clear cutting was this ecological disaster, anytime a government says they're going to shut down something like that, you have the people in the industry of clear cutting that say, hey, we could never survive if you guys shut this down. But there does essentially at some point become this public interest point of, sorry industry, it's not in the greater public good to allow this level of resource extraction or this type of resource extraction. And so I think the US has been through that for hundreds of years, that we've seen kind of one big abuser in the group. The government's at some point had to step in and say, hey, this is no longer in the public interest to do it this way. You guys are going to have to evolve, or else you're going to have to quit, essentially. And those do cause dips in the economy, but it's not anything that the U.S. has never not overcome. So.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any other pushbacks? You gave us some data as far as the poundage per hour and all those kind of things. Is there anything that they're saying to from the other side that, no, David, you aren't right, here's what we want the public to know?
Yeah, so if you get into this back and forth of trawl, typically their greatest point or bullet point or whatever you want to call it is that they make a ton of money from it. And that is great for the boats, and that's great for the owners, and it's great for Washington State, but it's not necessarily great for Alaska or Alaskans. But the reason they have been so successful in pulling off that specific argument is that the NPFMC exists under the umbrella of NOAA Fisheries, and NOAA Fisheries, not everybody knows this, exists under the Department of Commerce. That's kind of a nonsensical thing. We think of NOAA Fisheries as like save the whales, give us the weather, all this great ecological, biological stuff. But at its heart, it's run by the Department of Commerce that's saying, hey, we want maximum United States profits off of these fisheries. And so what trawl has been so successful in doing is these Alaskan issues and concerns have been around for decades. The ecological concerns have been around for decades, but they kind of skip over us and they go up to the Secretary of Commerce 6,000 miles away and say, hey, if you guys shut us down, this is, they say they make $2.5 billion a year off of pollock, but Alaska doesn't make $2.5 billion per year, but the Secretary of Commerce is looking at this nationwide international global trade scheme, and it doesn't want to see the United States in general ever lose on that scenario, even if it's not the best thing for Alaskan residents.
Is that $2.5 billion on pollock, is that in our waters, or is that like...
No, that's fish coming from offshore of Alaska.
$2.5 billion. So that's the trawling industry. That is kind of the
correct.
number.
And the interesting thing there is that that's so every industry, if they are allowed to make their own data, is going to probably skew it. But that's like final sale. So, like I was saying before, when they go out and catch a pollock, the cannery might pay them 9 cents per pound. The state of Alaska gets 3.5% of this 9 cents per pound. But then it goes through all these processing stages. And when you're in the example of a factory trawler, this comes up with Trident Seafoods a lot, is that they own the entire chain of command. So they catch the fish out of the boat on this factory trawler, and they take it all the way through branding to where it hits the shelf in Costco.
Yeah.
And so they take the profits from every step of this. And that, there again, back to your question of like what would happen if we weren't processing pollock, it would fall away from these big conglomerate and like super corporations to it would become more inefficient, which is better for the economy. So it wouldn't just go that this single person caught the fish and took it all the way to Costco. It would go through resellers and shippers and processors and all these independent steps, hopefully in Alaska, to reseed the money in that way. So,
and I just want to say, and I don't think you are either, but we're not against people making money. We're not against companies making money. We're not against them doing well. But at some point when it's starting to impact the entire ecosystem and go far beyond just the little area of pollock, that's when we have to think about doing it responsibly. And when I think of, for instance, our oil industry, our gas industry, the way they've been, really stepped up to be good stewards, to do what they do responsibly, that's what we want to see, because, and that begs the question about the technology out there to get a better sense. Like I said, I felt like NOAA could probably, there is technology where they could do a decent measurement of what's happening, the unobservable bycatch. But isn't there technology that these trawlers could be using to ensure they're not, that the nets would come up or whatever, that they're not disturbing the ocean floor, that they're even, well, I know we talked about the slotted spoon and the chicken soup, but even something where I need to see a demonstration. I obviously do. You are the expert and I'm learning, but any kind of technology that even could close things, so there's or it would sense the halibut nursery, and lift up and get out of there. Isn't there technology where the trawling vessels could be getting their pollock but doing it in a more responsible fashion? Maybe they wouldn't make quite as much money, obviously, because the more they scoop up, the more pollock they get. But isn't there technology out there? Is it being developed that maybe could help them do it in a more responsible way?
It is, and that's what brings us back again to who sits on the NPFMC and has those voting seats. So there is mountains of data. There's insane amounts of technology and strategies from other nations that have had proven reductions in bycatch and reduced seafloor habitat interactions. One big one that always comes up is trawlers from other areas will say, if you just slow down, you don't get as much halibut bycatch, or if you don't trawl at night, you don't get as much halibut bycatch. And so they'll look at our page and just roll their eyes into oblivion that this is well known in other areas. But the big eye roll is that this NPFMC, this USA Governing Council, which purports themselves as the best regulatory body in the world and has all these Alaskan representatives on it, doesn't enforce that. And so that's where we run into these issues. And there's been conversations about they have what they call like salmon excluders and halibut excluders that are designed to let some of those fish come out of the net. And those have been around for decades in various forms. But unless there's regulatory enforcement that says, hey, if you guys can't cut down your bycatch, you're out of here. There's no financial incentive for a corporation to do that. Why would they? And we've seen that, like on the North Slope. If there's this analogy of one drop of oil out of the pipeline could shut it down until it gets fixed. That's because the regulation has forced that. If there was no regulation that the pipeline couldn't leak, we'd probably see leaks all over the place, and that's what trawl is. And there again, to extend that analogy, if all the oil regulatory boards were made up of oil industry executives, then that's how they would write those rules, and that's how they would interpret them, even if everybody knew that wasn't quite right. And so that's where this issue of politicians, and especially governor candidates, being too scared of this issue to take it on, has compounded over decades to get to this point where there's almost anything you look at with trawl regulation isn't common sense anymore, and that's because we just haven't put strong representatives on the NPFMC. There's one really interesting thing with Magnuson-Stevens and the creation of the NPFMC, or all the regional fisheries councils, is that they had an acknowledgement when they made this council that they didn't want people 6,000 miles away in Washington, D.C. to be regulating fisheries in Alaska. They said, hey, we understand that we're not on the fishing grounds ourselves, so we're going to have fishermen regulate their own fisheries. And so because of that, they kind of created some weird recusal rules, or conflict of interest rules. So they said at the time that if you owned X amount of a fishery, say you owned 30% of the pollock trawl quota and you were on the NPFMC, that you wouldn't be able to vote for a pollock allocation, because obviously that would be this conflict of interest. But what they didn't do, or forgot to do, is they didn't say if your employer owns 30% of the pollock industry that you can't vote on an issue like this. So now we have people on the NPFMC, many of them, who are active employees of corporations that have trawl, but they don't personally own any trawl quota, so they're not forced to recuse themselves from these regulatory decisions, which massively impact their employer. And there again, that's something that Washington, D.C. or Congress or Bycatch or anybody could get into and say, hey, this would be a pretty common sense modification of this regulation, but it just hasn't happened. So.
There's another piece of this which is interesting, and I think a lot of people in rural Alaska know about it, but other Alaskans may not. And it's the CDQ program, the Community Development Quota, that they're getting a percentage of. Is it all commercial fisheries? But the biggest chunk is, of course, from the trawling industry, and it's pretty important to those communities in the coastal areas. And so, whereas upriver, many of the villages are suffering because of trawling, you have coastal villages that actually reap a benefit. And is that part of maybe why we haven't made forward movement? A lot of things come down to politics, right? And you've talked before, and there's big money, and the trawling industry will tens of thousands of dollars to candidates and things like that to try to make sure they can keep doing what they're doing. But can you talk about the CDQ program? Because I know that, how long has that been around, and do you know the percentage they get from trawling versus other types of commercial fishing?
Yeah, so I can talk about it generally. The Magnuson-Stevens Act was created in 1976. It kicked out the foreign boats, or 200 miles offshore, and so then ever since then it's been this rebuild of USA regulated trawlers and other USA fisheries. But after they'd been around for a few years, Stevens, the story goes, had this concern that there was like this factory fish model, and they were seeing all these fish being taken out of Alaska waters, or the waters right offshore of Alaska, and going elsewhere. They never touched ground in the local communities that would have historically made money off of Bering Sea fisheries.
Benefit here.
Correct. And so they did, it was a good idea, this, what they called a community development quota. And they said, hey, each time we rationalize a fishery in the Bering Sea and essentially give ownership of the pounds to an individual or a corporation, we're going to set aside 10% of that and give it to these CDQ communities. And to define that, they said that was any community within 50 miles of the Bering Sea. So if you look at the map of western Alaska, you see this perfect little strip of 50 miles wide. All these communities receive benefit from it. And same deal as before, they had received like 10% of the crab quota, 10% of longline, 10% of the trawl quota, but as those other fisheries have dipped, trawl has become a bigger and bigger part of that portfolio. And another interesting thing with that is that it feels like a lot of the outside corporate entities, like the Seattle-based trawl corporations, have now entered into these partnerships with the CDQ, where they there's an example of that in Bristol Bay, where one of the Seattle corporations has co-purchased a boat with the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation. And so now they're kind of inserting themselves in this way, and we're starting to see this messaging even from the Seattle boats that say, you guys don't want to mess with trawl because you'd hurt yourself. But when you really dig in the numbers and the ownership of the boats and the entities, what you see is it's actually co-owned by this Seattle corporate structure. So that it's obviously a compelling thing. It's not something which can be ignored. But there again, we're seeing Seattle is realizing that, hey, an Alaska politician doesn't want to take money away from these coastal Alaska villages, so let's just throw ourselves in with them at the same time and complicate the issue, which they've done a great job of. But bigger than that is that a lot of the people living in the CDQ communities are opposed to trawl. You know, we'll see good things about helping with funding for a school, or like a subsidy for buying boats or repairing four-wheelers or heating oil, which are all good and important, but it doesn't necessarily create many jobs in the communities. A lot of the fish still isn't hitting ground, so you'll see like an executive, this massive discrepancy in how a lot of the CDQ money hits in terms of jobs. You'll see a CEO or a COO of a CDQ company makes $300,000 per year, but there's hardly any lower paying jobs in the community. It's just turned into this subsidy. So there's been a lot of issue with that, and there's really this question of, is that ethical? Is that what Stevens had intended to have happen? And also this bigger question of, if trawl crashes and these CDQ communities have essentially gone all in on this and become overly dependent, then how does the world bail them out? How much?
Well, yeah, and I think that's it's all about stepping back and looking at the big picture, because we could be soon on the verge of a crash, and it's happened other places. So then they're not going to get anything. And are we talking 10% of 2.4 billion is what is going to these communities?
Yeah, so I want to say, so some of the communities have bought more. So they were originally, it's not correct to say gifted, but they were given this set aside of 10% of the quota. And I think they say now that CQ communities own 24% or 25% of the total quota or fishing interest. But that is a little convoluted. You can't quite say that's 25% of 2.5 billion, because they aren't Trident Seafoods that takes the fish from the ground and then sells it in Costco or a McDonald's for $10 a sandwich. They're somewhere in the middle. So, but yeah, certainly money into it. So it also, though, has set up this interesting dynamic, especially on the Yukon River, because you have, so we'd said before that the CDQ community band covers the first 50 miles from the ocean inland. And so you have, this is an exaggeration, but if a village is 49 miles up the Yukon River, it receives CDQ benefits. So they might be a little bit less concerned that they don't have as much salmon coming back. But everybody from 50 miles up, all 1,500 miles into Canada, is devastated essentially, and they get nothing from trawl. So now you have this battle, like a cultural battle or a battle between Alaskans of, hey, that's great that you guys get benefits from this, but what about the rest of the state?
Yeah, we don't need that kind of regional disunity, so we just need to solve it. Speaking of solving it, you have laid a great foundation. I want to talk a little bit about the different solutions. We've talked about the members, but maybe some specific things that could be done. But basis and the foundation of knowledge that I am very, very grateful for it, because it is a complex issue.
It is.
If you haven't been living and breathing that world, and you do a great job of making very understandable. And I just want to say, one of the things that when I was in the private sector, before I stepped up and served in the legislature, I made a trip. I think it may have been my first trip to Juneau. I was working in the healthcare arena. And I was taken in to speak to one of the very important senators at the time. I believe he had a seat on the finance table. And I had someone there that was kind of escorting us, knew the all the offices and the people. And I went in and I sat down and I said to the senator, I'd like to educate you on this issue. And I went on to explain it. And when we walked out, the person that was with me said, don't ever tell a legislator you're going to educate them, because they think they know everything. And I thought, wow, there's certainly no way to know everything. You cannot be an expert on everything. And so one of the things while I was serving is I was like, I am not going to have that kind of attitude. And I made the point when people came in to tell them I wanted them to educate me and thank them for educating me, and would ask a lot of questions so I would really understand it. And the feedback I got over the years, and even since I've been out, people have come to me and said, you know, when we came to your office, you are always eager to learn, and we appreciated that. And you were like really engaged, where we felt like sometimes people were looking at their watches and just biding the time. But to me, it's so important for someone like me who is asking Alaskans to hire me as their next governor, for me to learn and know what I can, but also know that I'm not going to reach the level of knowledge that you have on this. And so to find those people who are experts that we can trust. And I want to learn. I want to hear what the processors have to say. They did speak at the May hearing, and so I kind of know what some of their concerns are. But there was one bit of knowledge before we go into some specific solutions and like the kind of things that should be happening at the council level. One piece of information that I think skews people's minds is when the trawlers say they only, 2% of their catches bycatch. Could you speak on that one, because that sounds like 2%, that's not much.
Yeah, so that turns into a math lesson. So there's a couple different sectors essentially of trawl. One is bottom trawl, where the nets are intentionally on the bottom all the time, and that's going to be pretty dirty. They'll talk about like 25 or 30% bycatch. So if they caught 10 pounds of fish in that, they might throw away 3 pounds and keep 7 as your 30% bycatch rate. But pollock specifically has gotten away with, since they catch such massive volumes of fish, about 3 billion pounds per year, they and NOAA Fisheries and the Department of Commerce, kind of having their back, will say that, hey, we only catch, our bycatch rate is only 1 to 2%. That's one of the cleanest fisheries in the world. And as a percentage, it is, but when you take a step back from that and do the math, 1 to 2% of 3 billion pounds is 30 to 60 million pounds of waste. And that's just what's coming up to the boat to be observed. So there again, you get back to this unobserved bycatch, and these nets towing 6 square miles of seafloor per day. Nobody knows what's getting mowed down in that. But even without that, the 1 to 2%, since it's such a massive number, is huge. And to really go on top of that, the bigger question is 3 billion pounds of pollock, if that's the food fish for the rest of the Bering Sea ecosystem, sustainable in and of itself, or is that going to cause the big crash, which is the big concern? So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, because that's one of the pushbacks. And as Alaskans are learning more about this, there's been a lot on the problem of the bycatch from the people that want to stop it. So we're probably going to start hearing from the other side. So when you hear that, when folks hear that 2%, they need to realize that's still a lot of fish.
It is.
A lot of fish, and it is impacting us across the state. So some of the solutions that we can do, so specifically, if we got people in there that really cared about our fisheries overall, we're looking at the big picture, and we got those 6 people in, the commissioner, and I would expect the commissioner to kind of lead the charge as far as the regs. What are the kind of things that we would want them specifically to focus in on at the council level?
So really, my big rant from this, so a little while ago you were talking about how this is so complex and you need all these inputs and nobody can ever really understand it. And that goes for me too, and that goes for people on the NPFMC, that goes for the trawlers. There's just so many bullet points, but that's one way of looking at it. But the other way to look at it is to ask the very simple question of, is it sustainable and are the regulations common sense? And if it fails there, then that's an answer in and of itself. If it's not sustainable and it's not going to allow these fisheries for our kids and grandkids, then it has to stop. We don't know how it will be stopped. We don't know what perfect regulation will do it. We just have this feeling in our gut that, hey, something has to change. And when you acknowledge that, all the micro details kind of become obscured because there's this overriding principle of, hey, this isn't sustainable. So back to your question. The big issues that we have in the NPFMC, or that I take personal offense to, I guess, is just this lack of common sense in interpretation of the regulations. So we have massive areas offshore of Alaska that have been closed to bottom trawl because NOAA Fisheries has made this acknowledgement that, hey, when a trawl hits the seafloor, it crushes this habitat. There's slow-growing corals that might take 100 years to come back. That's where the fish and crab reproduce. We need this habitat. Moose need habitat, bears need habitat, fish need habitat. And so they've closed these massive areas to bottom trawling because they know that a bottom trawl is bad. But then we have these midwater trawlers who are allowed legally to drag on the seafloor, and the NOAA documentation says they do 40 to 100% of the time, that aren't banned from these banned areas. So NOAA Fisheries knows that they're on the seafloor. NOAA Fisheries knows that trawling on the seafloor would be terrible, but they aren't putting the two together.
And where's the common sense?
Correct.
Are those mid-trawlers, are they as large? Are they sweeping the same amount of acreage? Or
yeah, they're actually some of the biggest ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing is that if our 6 people would say, okay, mid-trawlers cannot drag the bottom.
For sure.
What's another one?
So we talked a little bit about the issue of halibut nurseries in the past. There is some, it kind of gets into a biology lesson, but they say that all the halibut on the west coast of the U.S., so like Canada, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, all these halibut will meet up in deep water, they spawn, and then the currents carry these fertilized eggs all the way up to the Bering Sea. And that's where they settle, and that's where they spend the first 6 years of their life or so. And they call these halibut nurseries. And the halibut biologists have designated, hey, this is a halibut nursery. If you're intentionally fishing for halibut, you can't fish here because we have to protect these juvenile fish. But the NPFMC, even knowing that, has said, well, since the trawlers aren't intentionally fishing for halibut, we're not going to say they can't fish here because it's essentially
That's crazy.
an accident. It is. And so they report about 4 million pounds of halibut bycatch from the Bering Sea. Not all of it comes from the nurseries, but there's some. But those fish only average about 5 pounds per fish. So if you're talking 4 or 5 million pounds of 5-pound halibut, you're talking maybe a million individuals, which is getting pretty close to what all the other halibut fishing fleets combined catch in a year. So there again, that's just this massive common sense thing, and that's what kind of builds the burning fire, I guess, for me or anybody in Alaska, is that we know this is an issue. We know that halibut fleets and halibut fisheries are suffering, but the big guys in the room with the money and the votes on the NPFMC are preventing anybody from doing anything about it.
So we're talking mid-trawlers don't drag the bottom, restrict the area so they can't trawl where there's nurseries, and is there a third one?
Yeah, so another big one which has come up is, so we talked about chum salmon subsistence on the Yukon River has been closed since 2020, so it's 5 or 6 years in on that. But simultaneously, all the chum salmon that wind up in the Yukon River go out to the Bering Sea and live for 3 years to grow up and get big, and that's where a lot of the trawl happens. but there's currently no bycatch cap at all on chum salmon anywhere in the state. So there again, this has come up for 40 or 50 years that, hey, we have to put a cap on this. But without the Alaska votes on the NPFMC to say, hey, the state of Alaska and the Alaska residents need a cap on this, it just mysteriously doesn't happen.
So we're restricting Alaskans, but we're not restricting them, and it comes back kind of this Alaska first kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Mentally. So is there any other particular one for that would be good for a new group of 6 to come in and say, okay, those 3 things, is there a 4th one, or is that that would get things going in the right direction?
And a bigger system, so we talked a lot on this about how pollock is being written up as this forage fish. It's that one entity that converts the energy of the sunlight when it enters the ocean into a fish flesh, which everything else can eat.
Can the council do that, or does that have to be in law?
The council can essentially ask for anything to be explored, and they. So yeah, a ADFG commissioner, if he really wanted to take on trawl, he could come in with a litany of motions and say, hey, we're going to talk about this and vote on it. And then if the Secretary of Commerce didn't want to sign off on this vote, it at least triggers this conversation or this debate, or hey, NOAA Fisheries is going to have to look into this, essentially because the governor is raising hell through the NPFMC. The reason I'm asking, because
when I kind of laid out my plan, I had that one as something we should press for a kind of a law change where NOAA has to have, well, it could be in regs, but definitions. So NOAA does regulations separate from this particular council, right? Because it's got all these councils. So you basically want NOAA to define pollock as is it called forage fish?
Yeah.
Right. So I kind of had that in a different bucket, but that's okay. I mean, we definitely would want our members to press for it. Then, as far as state waters and state regs, there's a number of things we could do, and like we talked about, Senator Cron's SB 161, and Representative Kevin McCabe has the House version of that, and he's been very helpful to me on this issue, and I think he's written maybe a blog or an article about it as well. And the state water issue, there are different things we could require them to continue with their electronic monitoring. If they're doing it in federal waters, when they come to state waters, keep it on 24/7. We could have undercover observers. Troopers come as undercover observers. We could make sure our observers have training so they realize that they won't miss something, that that they won't be tricked about anything, and those are options that would help. And then I'm trying to remember in state waters what else besides electronic monitor and the observers and the undercover. Was there another one?
Well, I think those are the big ones. I think you talked about penalties for if a midwater net was actually on bottom.
Which goes back to NPFMC. You were saying some of these regs are actually on the books. They're not enforcing them. So that's another thing our 6 members could do, right, is push for enforcement of the regs that are on the books.
Yeah, and that's the crazy one with this, how many crab were in the net example. So they say if your midwater net was on the bottom long enough that it pulled up 20 crab, then it's magically illegal. But if it only pulled up 19 crab, then we're going to say it wasn't on bottom at all. And that works well for trawl, because they can design a net where the crab come into the net and fall back out. They might be crushed or dead, but as long as they don't get up on the deck to be counted, it doesn't matter legally. And the other interesting thing about observers that we should talk about in general is that the public has this opinion that if a fish has an observer on it, a fisheries observer is there, then that every fish that comes out of that net is going to be counted or observed, essentially, or that they couldn't throw anything back illegally without somebody seeing it, or they couldn't drag on bottom without the observer knowing. But none of that's correct. The observer's primary job is strictly biological. So say that a net comes up with 200,000 pounds of fish in it. The observer will go down, they have this basket that holds about 50 pounds of fish. They scoop up a random sample, hopefully, take it back, and then they start to look at what's in the fish's stomach, or they take scale samples, or they measure the fish, and they're writing down all this documentation. But what's happening to the other 200,000 pounds of fish in the net on the deck at that same time is unknown, especially on a boat that might be, a 300-foot factory trawler type thing. The observer just can't keep up with any of that.
Would there only be one observer on that large vessel?
Only one working at a time. So what we'll see, again, it's kind of this trawl talking point, and NOAA Fisheries has their back, is that all the factory trawlers fishing in Alaska are required to have what they call 200% observer coverage. But all that means is that each time that boat leaves the dock on a trip, it has 2 observers on board. But a factory trawler, and most of the trawlers, will fish 24 hours a day. So one person can't do a 24-hour shift. So if you have 2 observers on board, they split it, where one does 12 hours and the other one does the second 12 hours. So functionally, yeah, you'll only have 1 observer on board. And that also kind of brings up this weird nomenclature game of, there's another sector of trawlers that have what they call 100% observer coverage, which you would think means that they watch 100% of the fish. But that just means that 100% of their trips, when they leave the dock, they have an observer on board. But there again, if they fish 24 hours, this poor person observing can't stay up 24 hours. So maybe 50% of the catch that comes on actually gets sampled. So there again, this common sense is being thrown out the window, and nobody's quite sure if we took a more literal interpretation and literal enforcement of these regs that are already on the book, if that would reform the fisheries enough to where they could withstand and stick around, or if that would become so restrictive when reality kicked in that it wasn't financially viable for them anymore. But Alaskans don't want to sit back and wonder about that, and they don't want to be gate kept by the NPFMC members, who are essentially unwilling to ask those questions.
I want to pull my notes, because there was, I'm thinking on this, and the state water thing is, because, as governor, I would have jurisdiction over those 6 appointments, but working with the legislature on what we could do in 3 miles. So I wanted to make sure. Oh, the other thing, we covered. We covered the electronic monitor and the observers, the troopers, the training. We talked about increasing severity for violations. But the other thing we had, which does not solve the problem, but it might deter it and maybe make up for some of the economic loss, whether it's to the non-trawler commercial fishing industry, as well as the families who rely on fish on their tables, and that is having some sort of fee in addition to the 3.5% landing fee or tax for the loss of food security, economic security for the commercial fishing industry, and food security for the people that rely on it for personal and subsistence use. And the state would have the ability to do that, to try to make up for the millions of dollars in loss, both in food on the table and do you have an idea what the economic loss is to the rest of the commercial industry? Is anybody work those numbers?
They probably have, but it's often, there again, we rely on NOAA Fisheries to do this. Department of Commerce kind of has trawls back, or that's how it looks. And so when they look at economic loss, they'll say, economic loss due to climate change, fisheries loss due to climate change. And we say, well, climate change and, let's be realistic that there's more to this conversation. So I think those numbers are out there, but I don't have them off the top of my head, and I'm positive that you will never see a NOAA document that says trawling has cost Alaskans.
So if we decided to add something to that landing fee to make up for the food and economic loss, the state would kind of be on its own. I mean, I'm sure we wouldn't just pull a number out of the air, but we would try to have some basis for it. But it's not a ready. It's not ready data from NOAA.
No.
Actually. So, well, we have been chatting a while. Is there anything else that you think that you want people to know and you want me to know? As I am pursuing a pathway that hopefully I can help fix this, at least really address it and hard, and one of the things that is always challenging, there's certain things, the appointments, I can control those. And I would vet those people and make sure the goal would be that they'd be on the same page. My commissioner would be on the same page to really go in and not decimate, if all the processors left town. I mean, we have to realize we might have to do some ramp downs, and we want to do this in a way that we understand it impacts people's livelihoods, but we also want to do it in a way that's going to prevent a crash of our fisheries overall. So I don't think there's time to waste on this, but my goal would be vet those people, make sure they were solid. I would expect input. We got lots of input as far as the State Board of Fisheries.
Yeah.
Like we talked about earlier, the fish wars. So you'll have, people, just, oh yeah, you got to confirm this guy. Oh no, this person's terrible. Don't confirm him. So that, we hear that. So as far as for this NPFMC, we'd want to make sure we had a solid group and a good commissioner, of course. So that's the most control that I would have. As far as what we were talking about earlier, undercover observers, those things like that, that would go through the legislature. And I've had the good pleasure of being in the legislature, and there are hundreds and hundreds of bills introduced, and very few make it through. It's quite the science and art to get something through. I have had good success moving major things across the finish line. As squirrely as the legislatures we all can be, and I put myself in there too when I was in. So that there's a real strategy to all of that, but I don't control it. There's 60 people that will be involved in that. Would there be interest in that? There could be. The CDQ thing we were talking about earlier might impact some people not wanting to go there, but I think it's time to have that conversation, because I think if we came out and we got our 6 members sticking together, and we did something like Senator Cronk and Representative McCabe's bill, we would really be saying, we mean business. This is a serious issue. We cannot just kick the can down the road anymore. There's a big picture here and some serious stuff at stake. People love their moose, and people need to be thinking about this in relation to caribou and moose now. That's kind of a new thing we haven't been talking about. And we may be early on that. We may be at the very beginning of that. But if you don't address it, what is that going to be in 5 years? What's that going to be in 10 years? So the ramifications are pretty extensive, I think. Yeah. So, anything else?
Well, I think that, I feel like you'll eventually get this trawl rebuttal, which essentially says that they'll try and cook up some way to tell you as governor representing all the Alaskans that it's not ethical or it's not procedurally correct for you to take on an issue like midwater nets are touching bottom. They aren't actually midwater. Or they'll cook up a way to say, oh, it's not ethical, or it's not your business to say that these trawls shouldn't be in halibut nurseries because XYZ data says it's no big deal. But I think the governor has to have the ability, if you're representing the Alaskans, to say, you know what, if you tell me I'm not allowed to ask this regulatory question, that makes me more suspicious. That's where it fails, when they say that people and Alaskans aren't allowed to ask questions. That means, I think, that they don't want the answer to the question to come out. So that's where leadership has to be really brave and say, hey, if you tell me I can't ask that, I'm going to ask it twice, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. And that's what Alaskans are clamoring for in leadership. And it does take understanding, but it also takes this power over the NPFMC of a strong ADFG commissioner that goes in and says, I know this motion is going to be horribly contentious with the trawlers in the room, but we have to flush it out, and maybe it'll wind out being that it benefits you in the end, or maybe it won't, but we're not going to be scared of the question anymore. So.
Hey, I've got a question. Where does NPFMC meet? How often do they meet? Do they move it around between Seattle and here, or what's the schedule?
So there's typically 5 meetings per year. They usually take the summer off because they want fishermen engagement. There's one in June, and the next one's not until October. And the majority of the meetings are in Anchorage. I think they typically set aside one Seattle meeting for the year, and then they also do a meeting which is meant to rotate. So a couple years ago that happened in Homer. This year it happened in Oregon. But a lot of them are in Anchorage. When COVID was happening, they couldn't do the in-person meetings anymore, and so they switched to an online format. A lot of people have trouble with that because it lessens the engagement that people
Are they back
can
in
have.
person now?
It's been all over the place. With the government shutdown, they switched to saying, hey, we don't know if we have enough money for this. So they did it. So it's back and forth. Yeah, it's really meeting by meeting. So.
Okay.
And the another important thing for people to know is that you can Google next or current NPFMC meeting, and about 3 weeks before the meetings start, they'll put out an agenda for that meeting, and you can do written public comments on that up until about a week before the meeting starts. So that's a good way for people to engage, even if you can't make it to the meeting.
So I expect people will watch this long form over the next few months, but right now, is there a deadline if somebody sees this soon and weighing in? Is it with NOAA on the chum limit?
It is, yeah. So it's the second now, I think. So January 5th is the deadline for essentially NOAA Fisheries is asking this question to the public of, hey, do you think there should be a bycatch limit on chum salmon in the Bering Sea at all? While subsistence on the Yukon is simultaneously totally shut down.
Suffering,
so yeah, so that
right.
We talk about it on the Facebook group quite a bit. Maybe you guys want to do a Facebook or a link to it, but yeah, people could get in there, and you don't have to be a scientist.
Actually, I did put it on a link on my page,
yeah,
also
good.
just so people are aware. So yeah, so we may miss that deadline a little bit for some, but there'll be other things that come up related to trawling. You think over the next 6 months?
Absolutely, yeah.
Other things to weigh in. So
yeah.
just monitoring, actually. So that link it is on my page, so people can just monitor it in general. Is there a way to sign up, like for notifications when something is up?
So the NPFMC website does this kind of funky thing where you can sign up with them, and they will send you texts like as a meeting is happening. It says that, hey, this section of the NPFMC is finished discussing this, and they're headed to lunch, and after lunch they're going to take up this next agenda item. But a lot of that doesn't come out until it's too late to sign up for the comment period, so it's kind of nice, but it's not super helpful. A lot of times the Facebook group or just social media in general is the best time.
Do you put meeting notifications, I'm guessing, on your Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch page, and how far in advance does a person have to sign up? What's the cutoff?
So there's two ways to do it. So the written public comment period opens about 3 weeks before the meeting happens, and then that shuts off right before the meeting begins, so you can't write in anymore. And then after that, kind of as an agenda item opens up, they will open it up. There would be a sign-up sheet where you could call in or you could show up in person.
To give public testimony. Do they time limit?
Yeah, so it's 3 minutes for an individual, or I think 5 minutes for an organization.
Okay.
And that's been another pretty heavy critique, is that so these 5 meetings, each one of them, if you go start to finish, takes about 2 weeks per meeting. So if you went to every meeting every day of the year, you'd be about 2.5 months of just NPFMC.
So one meeting is every day for is it Monday through Friday, or do they meet on the weekend?
They've bent that a little bit since COVID. It varies, but 10 to 14 days of meetings. And one of the issues we've run into is that if somebody shows up, so they watch this video and they're wound up on bycatch, and we should have these common sense regulations, they'll say, oh, we really love your feedback, but since you didn't come to all the meetings, you just don't understand, or kind of give this impression that Alaskans shouldn't weigh in with their opinion because they haven't engaged at the same rate that a trawl lobbyist who gets paid to go to the meetings has. And so there again, from an ethical perspective and like an Alaskan perspective, that's been really frustrating to me, is that they say, oh, we would welcome your feedback, we'd love to hear more, we want to do what's right. But if somebody says something which actually challenges them, then it kind of reverts to this, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to overcome that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, this has been full of information and insight for a lot of people. I know a lot of people are getting caught up on the issue, but I think we've covered have we covered pretty much everything you think
Yeah,
that
I
I
mean,
need to know and that the public would be interested to know?
yeah, I mean, I think the public needs to be reasonable in what it can expect an Alaska governor to do, and the absolute strongest thing a governor could say, or the strongest thing a governor candidate could promise, is that we're going to take full use of this ability to put a majority of the NPFMC members on there, and they're all going to be against trawl, or at least open to asking these tough questions. And after that, it's really going to get into federal politics and lawmaking, and it's going to get hammered out in different ways after that. But to think that we've had this kind of succession of governors who've been unwilling to do that, that's really dug us into a hole. So it's going to take some leadership by a governor to come forward and say, hey, this is a plan, we're going to do it. And the big questions are going to be asked.
Well,
So,
I have never been in the pockets of special interest. In fact, you would not, while I was serving, you would not see lobbyists sitting outside my office. I had a reputation that I was going to gather the information, get up to speed, and get myself educated, vote on principle, vote on the way that people in my district wanted and the benefit of Alaskans. So that's the way I roll. And yeah, that's how we're going to do it.
yeah.
So with that, I just want to thank you again for taking this on, the Goliath, as David Bays from Homer. And we appreciate you, and my door is always open to you. Or there is another fellow that has reached out. I'm going to try to have some conversation with him on the same issue, has concerns, and he may give me some more tidbits that will be helpful. But one of the most important things when we learn about an issue like this, a problem, is how can we go about solving it. And that's the way my brain is wired. When I see a problem, it's like, okay, what do I need to know, and how can we address it? What can we do? And so that's what I've been busy doing, is I've been learning this issue starting back in May, when my eyes were really open to, okay, we cannot dismiss this any longer. It's time to take the bull by the horn. So you've been really helpful with that. And I guess I'll look back to all of you that are out there watching and learning. This will be posted, of course, on social media, so there's probably a place where you can make comments and give feedback, and so we'll be watching for that. Our next episode, we were pretty close to having it lined up, but I don't want to say what it is yet because we're not 100% sure. We don't have the date set. But again, we need a name for this long form. Is it going to be Hughes and Hard Questions? Is it going to be Hughes on the Horizon? Is it going to be something else more clever that you suggest and we like? We'll see. But thank you, David, again for being here for our very first inaugural episode. All right, with that, thank you all for joining us, and we'll keep learning along with experts of how we can help solve problems in Alaska. Thank you.
Paid for by Alaskans for Hughes, P.O. Box 1496, Palmer, Alaska 99645.